In the summer of 1968, a soldier stepped out of the ranks of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, in front of the Prime Minister of Australia, and said 5 words that the Army did not want on the record. "The machine guns are no bloody good." He was not exaggerating. He was not posturing. He had 23 stoppages in his last contact. 23 times in a single firefight, the weapon that was supposed to be the most dangerous thing his section could deploy had refused to fire. The Prime Minister listened. The Army's armorer investigated. The finding was that the corporal's cleaning kit was not with the weapon. He was sent back to the jungle with the same guns. What that exchange captured in 5 words on a parade ground at Nui Dat on a June morning in 1968 was the audible surface of a failure that had been documented in writing since April of 1962, known to the Procurement Committee since December of 1959, and flagged by 3 Allied armies before Australia placed a single order. Stay with me until the end, because the detail that explains how Australia chose this weapon after Britain and Canada had formally rejected it, and after American trials had documented its flaws, is the most extraordinary procurement story you will hear about this war. And the detail that explains what it cost the men who carried it is something that has never been told in full. Before we go any further, did you learn any of this in school? Because most Australians never did. And the reason why matters more than you might think. To understand what happened in Phuoc Tuy Province between 1966 and 1972 with the M60 machine gun, you must first understand what the weapon was, what it was designed to do, and the gap between those two things that the jungle exposed every time it rained. The M60 General Purpose Machine Gun was gas-operated, air-cooled, and belt-fed. It fired the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO cartridge from a disintegrating metal link belt at approximately 550 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of 860 meters per second. It weighed 10.5 kilograms without ammunition. Its effective range on its integral bipod was 800 meters. On the M122 tripod, the effective range extended to 1,800 meters against area targets. It could be fired from the shoulder, from the hip, from a prone position, from the doorway of a helicopter, from the ring mount of an armored personnel carrier. On paper, it was the most versatile infantry support weapon the Australian Army had ever fielded. It was also, in the specific conditions of jungle counterinsurgency warfare in southern Vietnam, a weapon that made extraordinary demands on its operators and punished them with measurable consistency when those demands were not fully met. Its lineage was German. The feed system came directly from the MG-42, the Wehrmacht machine gun that had inflicted such punishment on Allied infantry in the Second World War, that American ordnance officers spent years studying how to replicate it. The MG-42 had earned a reputation that crossed language barriers. German soldiers called it the Hitler Sage, Hitler's saw, for the distinctive tearing sound of its cyclic rate, which was nearly double the M60's 550 rounds per minute. Allied soldiers had names for it too, none of them polite. The point for the ordnance officers studying it in the late 1940s was that it worked. It worked in mud and sand and snow and dust. It worked when the men operating it were exhausted and the mechanism was fouled and the conditions bore no resemblance to a proving ground. The Americans wanted to replicate that. The bolt and operating mechanism of the M60 came from the FG-42, the Fallschirmjäger selective fire rifle. Both were products of the most intensive military engineering tradition of the mid-20th century. The synthesis, in theory, should have produced something formidable. It produced something formidable. It also produced something that would not tolerate dirt, that could not compensate for varying gas pressures, that required 3 trained men to operate effectively, and that would, under sustained fire in a tropical environment, either jam, overheat, run away, or shed components with a regularity that the men who depended on it described in language that has not softened with the decades. The Americans called it the pig. The nickname was not affectionate exactly, though it carried affection the way nicknames for difficult colleagues do. It was a statement of fact. The weapon weighed 3.5 times as much as the M16 rifle it sat alongside in an Australian section. Its appetite for ammunition meant that every other man in the section carried 200 rounds specifically for the gun on top of his own load. The gunner himself typically carried the weapon and 3 belts, a cleaning kit, and his personal weapon. Before food, water, grenades, radio batteries, claymore mines, and the spare barrel he was technically required to carry, he was already moving through 40-degree heat with more than 19 kilograms of machine gun system. The pig was the right word. The pig was his to feed, his to protect, his to carry, and his to answer for when it stopped working. The single most consequential design decision in the M60's engineering history was also the simplest. It had no gas regulator. Every comparable weapon of that era, including the German MG42 it descended from, and the Belgian FNMA G58 it competed against in the Australian procurement process, had one. The regulator allowed the weapon to compensate for variation in the gas pressure generated by different ammunition lots, different levels of fouling, different temperatures, different stages of barrel wear. Without one, the M60 was dependent on conditions remaining close enough to ideal that the fixed gas system could manage. When conditions departed from ideal, which they did in the Phuoc Tuy jungle every day, and in every direction simultaneously, the mechanism could slow, jam, or accelerate to runaway. A runaway M60 continued firing after the trigger was released. The standard technique for stopping it was for the assistant gunner to physically hold the ammunition belt, preventing further feed. This was not a procedure designed for a firefight. It was a procedure designed for a range. There were other problems built into the original design, and the men who found them were not the men who designed the weapon. The spring clip holding the trigger and grip housing assembly in place was known to be fragile from the first Aberdeen Proving Ground trials. Field soldiers in Vietnam wrapped theirs in duct tape and cable ties against the day it broke, because the day it broke was a question of when, not whether. The sear in the trigger mechanism wore down under sustained use, which increased the runaway risk the gas regulator problem had already created. A second sear notch was eventually added as a remedial fix, which solved the immediate wear problem and introduced its own tolerancing issues in older receivers. The barrel latch on early production weapons was a swinging lever rather than the push-button mechanism adopted on later versions, and it could catch on the gunner's webbing or equipment during movement and release the barrel. In a jungle patrol, the first indication that this had happened was sometimes the sound of the barrel falling into the undergrowth. The bipod was attached to the barrel rather than to the receiver, which meant that changing a hot barrel required the gunner to hold the receiver assembly aloft with one hand, while the assistant made the change with the other, a procedure that required an asbestos glove, a steady nerve, and an enemy who was prepared to wait. The thin sheet metal components on early production weapons bent and broke under the physical stresses of field use in ways the drawings had not anticipated. The weapon was, in the blunt assessment of its maintenance history, an accumulation of manufacturing compromises that each required a workaround, and each workaround introduced a new point of failure, and each new point of failure required a further modification, and the modifications arrived on a timeline that did not synchronize with the operational demands of the men in the field. This was the weapon that would become the primary firepower of the Australian infantry section in South Vietnam. One per section. The section arranged around it, resupplied for it, positioned in contact to serve it. And the decision to put it there had been made in a committee room in Canberra on the 18th of December, 1959, without a single production weapon having been fired on Australian soil. The Australian Army had been looking for a replacement machine gun since 1957. The problem was caliber. The Army was transitioning from the 303-inch rimmed cartridge to the 7.62 by 51 mm NATO round, and production of 303 ammunition in Australia was ending. A new general-purpose machine gun was urgent. Two weapons were in contention. The first was the Belgian FN Mag 58. The second was the American M60. The British had already made their choice. They had evaluated 6 weapons, narrowed the field to 3, and rejected the M60 on 2 documented grounds. First, it failed to meet the tactical requirement for indirect long-range fire to 4,000 yards. Second, it possessed what British evaluators formally recorded as technical deficiencies, including a complicated stripping procedure and excessive component breakages during trials. The British chose the Mag 58. The Canadians had reached the same conclusion by the same route and for the same reasons. The Americans themselves, who had designed and manufactured the M60 and were deploying it across their own forces, had documented the fragile trigger spring clip problem at Aberdeen before the weapon entered production. They knew. The Allies knew. The reports existed and circulated and were read. In Australia, the Director of Infantry had visited the United States in 1959 and fired an M60. He was strongly in favor of the weapon. 2 pre-production M60 examples had been obtained on loan for examination. They were not fired. They were pre-production weapons, and firing models would not be available until the end of 1959 at the earliest. On the 18th of December, 1959, the Weapons and Equipment Policy Committee met. The stated basis for the decision was the M60's general-purpose nature, its lighter weight relative to the Mag 58, and its availability within a 13-month time frame. Reports from British, Canadian, and American sources had highlighted difficult stripping procedures and excessive breakages during trials. The committee noted these concerns and voted anyway. It was choosing, the trials data would eventually confirm, the wrong weapon, and doing so against the explicit findings of the Allies best positioned to know. Australia cancelled its order for MAG 58 trial weapons. It placed initial orders for 971 M60 machine guns. The Rame Armory historian Mike Cecil, writing in the Army magazine in approximately 1995, surveyed this sequence with the measured language of a man trying to be fair to his institution and finding the task difficult. "It seems incredible," he wrote, "that such an important item could be purchased without any form of local trials whatsoever. That sentence took 35 years to write and has not improved with age." The first 6 production weapons arrived in April of 1961. 5 went to the infantry center. 1 went to the proof range. Bulk delivery began in February of 1962 when 300 weapons arrived, followed by 2 further consignments of 100 each. By April of 1962, just 2 months after the weapon had been issued in quantity, the breakages and seizures occurring across the force were at a rate that required formal investigation. Trials conducted on weapons from all 3 delivery consignments produced a verdict that the procurement committee had been warned about in the reports it had reviewed and set aside. The M60 was, in the precise language of the trial's conclusion, not reliable in the sustained fire role due to the prevalence of component breakages. A scientist from the Army Design Establishment was sent to the United States to help resolve the problems. The outstanding portion of the contract was deferred pending improved production weapons. Not unreliable in isolated conditions. Not unreliable under extreme circumstances. Not reliable across all 3 consignments in the sustained fire role, which was the primary role for which it had been purchased. The bipod breakages were severe enough that Australia seriously considered replacing them with modified Bren LMG bipods. In 1963, C Company of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, trialed the conversion and strongly favored it. The Army decided to wait for the improved American design instead. Many of the initial problems were eventually solved or diminished. Improved weapons arrived. Modifications were applied. The weapon that went to Vietnam was not quite the same weapon that had failed its reliability assessment in 1962. It was still an M60, and the jungle was still the jungle. Phuoc Tuy Province in 1966 was rubber plantations and rice paddies, granite hill masses and coastal villages, dense jungle on the slopes above the plains, and everywhere the red laterite soil that got into mechanisms, fouled links, contaminated rounds, and reduced the M60's considerable firepower to the rate at which its gunner could clear stoppages. 1 ATF at Nui Dat, sitting in the middle of the province like an island, had 1 M60 per infantry section. That was where the firepower of Australia's war in Vietnam lived. Not in the artillery at Nui Dat, though the artillery saved lives and changed battles. Not in the Centurion tanks that arrived in late 1967. In the rifle sections on patrol, moving through the jungle on days that started before sunrise and ended in the dark, and in the gun at the end of each section that was doing, at any given moment, one of 2 things: firing as intended and keeping people alive, or failing to fire and requiring the gunner to wrestle with it while the contact continued around him. The weight was the first reality. A gunner in the field was carrying a system that began at 10.5 kilograms and grew from there. The standard load for an M60 gunner in Phuoc Tuy typically meant the weapon, a 200-round belt in the gun, 2 additional belts across the chest, cleaning kit, and personal weapon. Beyond that came everything a patrol soldier carried: 3 days of rations, water for the same period, grenades, radio batteries, first field dressings, claymore mines for ambush. The spare barrel was also required equipment. It was bulky. It was heavy. In the heat of the Phuoc Tuy summer, handling an overheated barrel meant burns without the asbestos glove, and the asbestos glove was yet another item to carry and to keep track of in the dark. W.O. 1 Bob Thompson, Task Force Armorer in 1968, documented what he saw directly. Men were not carrying the spare barrel. Not all of them, not every patrol. Often enough. The mathematics of exhaustion and the mathematics of lethality do not always resolve in the same direction, and the men who made the decision to leave the spare barrel at the base were not reckless. They were tired, and 40 degrees, and 3 days from water resupply, and the spare barrel was 3 kilograms they did not have to carry. The belt problem was structural. The M60 was belt-fed. In the prone position, which was how you fired in jungle contact, the belt laid on the ground. In jungle terrain, that meant laterite dust, or mud, or the fine grit that accumulated in every crease and pocket and mechanism during a day in the field. The lynx picked it up. The rounds were contaminated before they reached the feed tray. A weapon with no gas regulator and tight manufacturing tolerances encountered dirty ammunition the way a precision instrument encounters a grain of sand. The Americans had found a partial solution in the field. B-3A cans from C ration packs, the small tins that came with beans in the field ration, were locked into the ammunition box attachment point on the weapon, which elevated the belt off the ground by several centimeters and improved the feed angle to the loading port. This was not a military modification. It was not in any manual. It was not the product of an ordnance committee's deliberation or a manufacturer's warranty response. It was soldiers solving a design flaw with a bean tin, in the dirt, because the alternative was a gun that jammed from the ground, and in the Phuoc Tuy jungle, you were always on the ground. The modification required no tools, no spare parts, no authorization from the chain of command. It required only that someone had already discovered the problem the hard way, survived long enough to devise the solution, and passed it to the next man who picked up the gun. Later production versions of the M60 revised the ammunition box attachment point and made the workaround unnecessary. The men in Phuoc Tuy from 1966 to 1971 were using the earlier versions. They were using their ration tins. There was, in the same period, a version of the M60 that worked rather well. The M60D, fitted with spade grips instead of the standard stock, was mounted in twin configuration in the door of the UH-1H Iroquois helicopters operated by 9 Squadron RAAF at Vung Tau. In that role, the slipstream of the aircraft's forward speed cooled the barrel continuously. A door gunner on a gun run could fire 500 to 1,000 round bursts in conditions that would have destroyed an infantry-mounted barrel in minutes, because the air moving over the gun at speed was doing the work that the asbestos glove and the spare barrel were supposed to do on the ground, and were so often not there to do. The belt fed from an ammunition box mounted to the aircraft frame, not from laterite soil. The crew environment reduced the accumulation of debris in the mechanism. The 3-man crew requirement was met by default. The door gunner could sustain fire that no infantry section could replicate, not because the weapon had changed, but because the platform had removed every condition that made the weapon fail. From 1969, 4 Iroquois aircraft were converted to the Bushranger configuration, with twin M60D flexible mounts per door, fixed miniguns, and rocket pods. The M60 was in that context one component of a coordinated weapon system, rather than the sole firepower of a 3-man crew in the dirt. The slipstream that saved the barrel and the aircraft mount that saved the belt tell you, in mechanical terms, exactly what the jungle and the laterite and the prone position had been doing to both for 6 years. The same weapon, different conditions, functionally a different gun. This was not something the December 1959 Procurement Committee had reason to anticipate. The M60 had been purchased for a Cold War European scenario as the standard general-purpose machine gun of a force expecting to fight Warsaw packed armored columns across the plains of West Germany. The jungle counterinsurgency role, the patrol support role, the sustained fire from a 2-man crew in dense vegetation with a belt lying in laterite dust, was not the role the Procurement Committee was optimizing for. The problem was that Vietnam was the role, and the men who had to make it work did not get to choose which war they were in. From the Australians who later received Lithgow rebuilt Bren guns, converted to 7.62 NATO, designated the L4A4. The recorded reaction was something rarely heard from soldiers about their equipment. They were, in the words preserved in veteran testimony of the era, utterly delighted. That is the emotional signature of relief. That is what it sounds like when men who have spent years managing a weapon's limitations are handed something that works the way they were told weapons were supposed to work. The Bren had been in Australian service since before the Second World War. Its gas regulator, its top-mounted magazine, its reputation for functioning in conditions that stopped other weapons were things that a generation of infantry soldiers had come to take as a baseline. When the M60 replaced it, the soldiers noticed the difference immediately. The delight at getting something resembling the Bren back, 20 years later, is a measure of what the intervening years had felt like. The M60 was still the weapon in their hands when D Company of the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, walked into the Long Tan rubber plantation on the afternoon of the 18th of August, 1966. Major Harry Smith commanded D Company. He had 108 men. The force they encountered, which had assembled overnight in the rubber east of Nui Dat after shelling the base the previous evening, was estimated at 2,500 North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong troops. The contact began at approximately 10 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. The M60 was one per section. Each 10-man section had distributed its spare barrel and ammunition load across the full section strength in the way the doctrine required. Every man in D Company was carrying rounds specifically for the gun. What followed was more than 3 hours of the most desperate close-quarter fighting in Australian military history. The rain came in at approximately 4:30 and continued through the battle, reducing visibility through the rubber trees to the length of a room. New Zealand gunners of the 161st Field Battery were walking their artillery fire closer and closer to D Company's position, some rounds falling danger close, and the calls back to the battery were not asking them to stop. They were asking them to continue because the alternative to a shell landing 90 meters away was a Viet Cong assault landing 3 meters away. Between those salvos, the M60's suppressive fire on both flanks was the margin that kept the enemy from closing the distance on men who were low on ammunition, lying in rain and mud and waiting for vehicles that had not yet arrived. As ammunition ran low, section commanders redistributed from the dead to the living, from the wounded who could no longer fire to the guns that still could. The M60 fed on that redistribution, consumed everything brought to it, and kept firing. By the time 3 APCs carrying relief troops arrived, D Company had suffered 18 killed and 24 wounded. The force opposing them had suffered casualties estimated at several hundred. The artillery had fired nearly 3,500 rounds. The M60 had fired until its belts ran empty and were replaced, and then until those belts were empty too. It had worked. Long Tan is the story the M60 tells about itself at its best. It is also, for that reason, the most important piece of context for what followed 6 months later. Because what Long Tan demonstrated was not that the weapon was adequate for all conditions. It demonstrated what could be accomplished by experienced crews, well-maintained weapons, full-section ammunition loads, and an emergency acute enough to override every compromise and every shortcut that the weight and the heat and the exhaustion of ordinary patrol life produced. The conditions of Long Tan were not the conditions of an average day in Phuoc Tuy Province. On an average day, the spare barrel was in the billet. On an average day, the belt had been in the laterite since first light. On an average day, the men carrying the gun had been carrying it for 6 hours before the contact started, and they would be carrying it for 6 hours more before they stopped. Operation Bribie began on the 16th of February, 1967, with a Viet Cong attack on a South Vietnamese regional force post at the coastal village of Lang Phuoc Hai, 15 kilometers southeast of Nui Dat. By the following morning, the assessment was that the attacking force, elements of D445 Battalion, was withdrawing to a position 2 kilometers north of the village near the abandoned hamlet of Ap Mai An. The 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, was deployed to cut off the withdrawal. They did not find a withdrawing force. D4. 4-5 Battalion had constructed a U-shaped defensive network across the undergrowth, with camouflaged fighting pits fitted with overhead cover and at least 6 machine gun positions arranged to deliver interlocking fire from the front and both flanks simultaneously. Visibility through the jungle was a few meters in any direction. 6 Australians from 2 platoon were killed or wounded within the first 60 seconds of contact. The gun battle that followed was not a battle of movement. It was a battle of suppression in which each side's machine guns were attempting to establish dominance of fire that would allow its infantry to advance and the other side's to break. The Viet Cong gun positions were well sighted, well constructed, and manned by fighters who had been in that jungle long enough to know exactly where to look for the Australians, and long enough to have learned what happened when an M60 opened up and where to direct their first shots. The 445 Battalion was not a militia unit improvising in the field. It was a main force battalion with years of combat experience in Phuoc Tuy Province, and it had prepared that position against the possibility of exactly the assault that came. The interlocking arcs of its machine gun positions were a professional military solution to the problem of stopping a force with Australian firepower. It had studied that firepower. It had accounted for it. 2 platoons from B Company attempted to destroy one of the enemy gun positions. Both were driven back. The gun kept firing. B Company's 6th platoon fixed bayonets and charged toward the position. Viet Cong fire halted the assault and drove them back. The position did not fall. 5 platoon received the order to attack the same position from a different direction. 2nd Lieutenant John O'Halloran gave the command. His platoon rose as one and ran forward. Lance Corporal Kerry Michael Rooney, 20 years old, from Victoria, led his section straight at the position. He threw grenades as he ran. He charged with his bayonet. He was killed before he reached it. He was killed before he reached it because the position had not been suppressed. A machine gun position that has not been suppressed fires on the men approaching it, and Kerry Rooney approached it, and it fired on him, and he died 3 meters short of what he had been ordered to reach. He died not because he lacked courage. He died because the thing between him and that position was still operating. The armored personnel carriers that could have changed the tactical situation had been withheld. The judgment was that dense undergrowth made the area unsuitable for vehicles. When the APCs were finally committed to extract the casualties under continuing enemy fire, a Viet Cong gunner put a 75mm recoilless rifle round through the open cargo hatch of one M113, killing the driver and wounding the vehicle commander. Soldiers already wounded from earlier in the fight were hit again. A second round struck the same vehicle as the survivors bailed out. The Australians destroyed the vehicle rather than allow the enemy to salvage its components. The fighting ended just before 7:30 in the evening. 8 Australians were dead. 27 were wounded. Across the full week of fighting around Bribie, 16 Australians were killed and 55 wounded. When the survivors returned to the battlefield the following morning, they found a message written in blood on the hull of the destroyed APC, Du Mei Uk Dai Loi. The translation is rough, but its meaning was not ambiguous. The enemy had held their positions for as long as they chose, and then withdrawn on their own terms. They had done it with prepared positions, interlocking fire, and the patience to wait for an assault that Australian doctrine said would follow suppression. The suppression had not been sufficient. The assault had come anyway. And the men who made it had paid for the gap between those two facts with their lives. Between Bribie in February of 1967 and Coral in May of 1968, the M60 complaints accumulated and were absorbed. Units reported stoppages. Armorers investigated. Modifications were logged as applied. The New Zealand troops serving alongside Australians in 1 ATF presented a specific and documented problem. They had trained on the Bren LMG before Vietnam and were issued M60 machines they had not trained on and, in many cases, did not maintain with the discipline the weapon required. The failure rates in New Zealand operated weapons were higher than in Australian operated ones. The institutional response was to record that New Zealanders were less familiar with the weapon, not to ask whether a weapon that produced higher failure rates when operated by less familiar users was suitable for rotation through a multinational force that regularly incorporated less familiar users. The distinction matters. One framing leads to a training solution. The other leads to a procurement question. The institution chose the training framing and did not pursue the procurement question. There were M60s in 1 ATF in 1968 that had been in the country for multiple rotations. The specific weapons the corporal would later describe to the Prime Minister were not an anomaly. They were, as he correctly suspected, the same weapons he had carried on his first tour. The Army's resupply of improved production weapons to a deployed operational force was measured against priorities that did not always put the machine gun at the front of the queue. The men in the sections did not set those priorities. They carried what they were given and maintained what they could, and made do with the rest, because making do was the only option available to them, and they were professionals, and professionals make do. On the 12th of May, 1968, 2 Australian infantry battalions, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the Royal Australian Regiment, with 3 artillery batteries and supporting arms, were lifted by helicopter into an area of operations 45 kilometers north of Saigon and 60 kilometers northwest of Nui Dat. The Americans called the area the Catcher's Mitt. It sat astride the infiltration routes that Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army forces had used to attack Saigon 1 week earlier during the Second General Offensive of the Tet Campaign. The Australians' task was to interdict these forces as they withdrew. The fire support base they established on the day of insertion was called Coral. The insertion was not smooth. Helicopters arrived piecemeal, hours behind schedule. Units were lifted to incorrect positions. National Serviceman Lieutenant Gordon Alexander, the artillery forward observer with D Company of 1 RAR, described the deployment into the landing zone as an absolute debacle. By nightfall, the base's defenses were incomplete. No barbed wire had been laid because the wire had not arrived. No claymore mines were in position. M60 machine guns had been placed around the perimeter, but there had been no time to test fire them, and no time to properly tie in their arcs of fire. This was not the choice of the men who placed them. This was the state of the position when darkness fell on a base that had been established that afternoon on a known infiltration route, in the Catcher's Mitt, in the second week of the Tet Offensive's second wave. The men on that perimeter had no wire in front of them, no mines, and machine guns they had not confirmed were functioning. They had their training and whatever ammunition they had carried off the helicopters. They lay down in the dark, and they waited. At approximately 3:30 in the morning of the 13th of May, 1968, a brief but intense rocket and mortar barrage fell on fire support base Coral. The assault followed immediately. Bombardier Andy Forsdyke was 23 years old and from Queensland. He was lying with his M60 machine gun team of 7 men approximately 20 meters out in front of 102 Field Battery when the attack began. His account, preserved in the Australian War Memorial's commemoration records, describes what happened in the darkness with the flat precision of a man who has been living with the memory for 50 years. The Viet Cong, he said, got up from all around them. They had crawled to within 4 feet of the M60 without the gun team knowing they were there. They were holding their AK-47s up in the air and spraying blindly. Forsdyke fired his M60. The gun jammed. He wrestled with it. 2 men fell to his rear, 1 dead and 1 wounded. At another position, Bombardier Darcy was looking at an enemy soldier and into the barrel of the enemy soldier's AK-47. He pulled the trigger on his M60. Nothing happened. The mortar platoon, 18 men under Lieutenant Tony Jensen, was being attacked simultaneously from a different direction. Enemy troops were moving through the position systematically, firing at each pit and each tent and each sign of occupation. 5 men of the mortar platoon were killed. 8 were wounded. Jensen, facing annihilation, ordered direct fire onto his own position from the anti-tank platoon's recoilless rifles, a decision that describes the nature of the choice available to him more precisely than any tactical analysis could. 2 Australians in the mortar pits, hearing Forsdyke's men call out that the enemy was between them and the mortars, called back that they had been taken. Their voices were heard. Their position could not be reached. The gun that was supposed to protect the space between them was in Forsdyke's hands, and Forsdyke was wrestling with it in the dark 4 feet from the men who had crawled up without him knowing, and he could not make it fire. Artillery gunners were firing 105mm howitzers over open sights at a range of approximately 100 meters into 200 enemy troops. They had not had time to construct overhead protection for their gun pits. The howitzer, the largest weapon available on that perimeter, was being used in the role of a very large pistol. The men serving those guns did so in the open, under direct fire, because the alternative was to stop serving them. They did not stop. By dawn, the attack had been repelled. 11 Australians were killed that morning. 28 were wounded. Their average age was 22. The attack on fire support base Coral was, according to the official history of Australian artillery, the most sustained ground attack on an Australian gun position since the Pacific War. It had been sustained in part by the M60 machine guns placed on the perimeter without time to be test-fired, and in part in spite of the same guns failing the men positioned behind them when they needed them most. Both things happened on the same perimeter, in the same hours, to the same weapon. That is the truth of the M60 at Coral. Not that it failed, and not that it held, that it did both, and the difference between which it did in any given position was a function of maintenance, preparation time, ammunition condition, and all the variables that a weapon without a gas regulator could not compensate for. 3 days later, on the 16th of May, Coral was attacked again, this time 3 North Vietnamese battalions. The base was now defended by armored personnel carriers of A Squadron, 3rd Cavalry Regiment, with properly tied-in M60 arcs and a perimeter that had had 3 days to be made defensible. The machine guns that had been placed without test firing on the 12th had been test fired by the 16th. The claymores were in position. The wire had arrived. the assault was stopped at the perimeter. 5 Australians were killed, 19 were wounded. 3 days of preparation had produced a different battle with the same weapon against a larger force. The preparation was the variable. The weapon's fundamental characteristics were not. The pattern continued through the Balmoral phase of the series. 2 regimental strength attacks against 3 RAR at Fire Support Base Balmoral on the 26th and 28th of May were repelled. On the second Balmoral assault, Australian machine guns combined with Centurion tanks firing canister shot and continuous artillery to stop the NVA attack on the wire before it could penetrate. The enemy left dozens of dead on that wire. Private John Iwankiw, photographed at Coral after the second heavy attack on the base, was surrounded by belts of M60 ammunition, holding his weapon against his chest. The photograph was not staged. It was an image of what an M60 gunner looked like when he had decided, from experience, that running out was not something he was willing to do again. The decision was written in the belts around him and in the look on his face. By the end of the full Coral and Balmoral series, 26 Australians were dead. More than 100 were wounded. The unit citation for gallantry awarded to the units involved came decades later. Bob Wilson, who had been there at 23 years old, said it felt like a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He said that when they came home, the Second World War veterans turned their backs. They didn't want to know. The recognition that arrived in the form of parades and memorials and a unit citation was deserved. It was not the same as an accounting. 3 weeks after the fall of Fire Support Base Coral, on or about the 8th of June, 1968, Prime Minister John Gorton arrived at Nui Dat. He had his entourage with him. The South Vietnamese ambassador to Australia, their wives, the people who travel with a prime minister on a wartime visit to a war. He went to 1st Battalion to speak with the men who had just fought the largest battle of Australia's Vietnam War. A corporal stepped out of the ranks. Major Digger Campbell, who witnessed the exchange, recorded it for Lex Macaulay's history of the Battle of Coral. WO1 Bob Thompson, who was summoned to deal with the consequence, preserved it in the RAEME's operational records. The Prime Minister asked how the corporal was going. The corporal said he was going fine and asked how the Prime Minister was going. The Prime Minister said he was fine and asked if the corporal had any worries. The corporal said he had a worry and asked for new machine guns. The Prime Minister, apparently surprised, asked whether the unit didn't already have machine guns. The corporal confirmed it did. But they were no bloody good. The Prime Minister asked what was wrong with them. The corporal said he thought they were the same bloody ones he had used on his first tour here 2 years ago, and that in his last contact, his gun had 23 stoppages. WO1 Thompson was in Captain Ron Hammond's office when the call came in. Hammond sent him to 1st RAR to sort it out. Thompson went directly to the battalion. He spoke with the sergeant armorer, who said there were no problems and all M60s were up to date with their modifications. He spoke with Major Campbell, who said he couldn't see any problems. Thompson asked to see the corporal's M60. The weapon was not the cleanest he had seen. It was presented without the spare barrel. The cleaning kit was not with it. Thompson reported that as far as he was concerned, there was no problem, and that he would recommend a full M60 inspection across 1st RAR the following day. The inspection was arranged. This was the official response to a man telling the Prime Minister of his country that the primary weapon of his section had failed to fire 23 times in a single contact. The weapon was dirty. The cleaning kit was elsewhere. the inspection was scheduled. What the inspection was not, and what no investigation that followed the PM's visit was an inquiry into whether the weapon's fundamental design contributed to its combat failure rate. Whether the absence of a gas regulator, documented as a deficiency since the Aberdeen trials, was still producing the same failures in Phuoc Tuy Province in 1968 that it had produced on the Aberdeen Proving Ground in the 1950s. Whether a weapon formerly found not reliable in the sustained fire role in April of 1962 was still not reliable in the sustained fire role in June of 1968. For the same structural reasons, in a different jungle, with men who were 9 years younger than the procurement decision that put the gun in their hands. The corporal's commanding officer described him as a bit of a smart arse. The task force armorer found the maintenance standard below requirements. The chain of command found the dirt before it found the flaw, and the procurement committee that had known about the flaw since 1959 was not consulted because the investigation was not that kind of investigation. It was the kind of investigation the institution knew how to conduct. It found what institutions find when they investigate themselves: a maintenance problem, an individual failing, a schedule for improvement. The Army sent him back. The cost of carrying the M60 in Phuoc Tuy Province was not only in the contacts where it failed. It was in the weight carried on every patrol before that contact arrived, and in the knowledge of what the weight was for, and in the specific arithmetic of what 7 seconds meant when the enemy's first shot was always aimed at the machine gun. The figure was not invented for morale management. It was a tactical assessment grounded in observed enemy behavior across multiple theaters of the war. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army identified the M60 in contact by its sound, its rate of fire, and its suppressive function. They aimed at it first because it was the weapon that could kill the most of them the fastest. The gunner was the man they could least afford to leave in operation, so he was the man they removed first. In American training, the 7-second figure was presented not as a deterrent, but as a tactical fact. From the moment the gun fired, the enemy knew the position and was already moving toward it. Victor Renza, a Marine Corps machine gunner, documented it with the flat precision of a man who had survived it. The trigger identified you. The seconds that followed were yours to spend correctly or not at all. Australian gunners in Phuoc Tuy received the same understanding through the same method, not through a manual, through the experience of surviving a contact and being told, by someone who had survived more of them, what the first seconds meant and why the assistant gunner's position on the left side of the gun was exactly as dangerous as it looked. The extraction failure was the most terrifying of the M60's documented technical problems in a contact. When the extraction cycle tore off the rim of a spent cartridge case, as it did with a regularity that was not exceptional, the jammed case required clearing with a cleaning rod rammed down the barrel from the muzzle end. In a firefight, this meant the gunner putting his weapon muzzle toward the enemy and ramming a steel rod down it, a procedure that took 15 to 30 seconds under ideal conditions and significantly longer under fire. The barrel latch could release during movement and deposit the barrel in the undergrowth. The sear wore, and the weapon fired without a trigger command until stopped by hand. In the door of a helicopter, in the slipstream at 60 knots, these problems were manageable. In the dirt of a jungle contact, at 7 seconds, they were not. The certainty is narrower but sufficient. The M60 was the weapon that was supposed to be firing in the moment before death, in every contact that turned fatal, for every Australian section in Phuoc Tuy Province from 1966 to 1971. And it was a weapon whose reliability had been in formal question since April of 1962, and for which no procurement review was initiated in response to that documented question until the Small Arms Replacement Project began in 1982. 20 years after the initial reliability failure, 10 years after the last Australian soldiers left Vietnam. The accountability for this sits in a committee room in Canberra on the 18th of December, 1959. The men in that room are in the record. At no point were they required to stand in front of the men who carried the M60 into Phuoc Tuy Province and explain the decision they had made. At no point did they. The small arms replacement process eventually concluded for the light machine gun role in favor of the F-89 Minimi. For the general support role, it concluded in favor of the Mag-58, designated the L7 in Australian service. The weapon rejected on the 18th of December, 1959, for being slightly heavier and requiring 13 more months to procure. The reasoning that had excluded it in 1959, that 13 months was too long to wait and the extra weight was too much to carry, had produced 23 years of carrying something worse. The accounting on that exchange does not resolve in the committee's favor. In the 1990s, the United States Army formally tested the M60 against the M240, which is the American designation for the MAG-58, by firing 50,000 rounds through each weapon and recording mean rounds between stoppages and mean rounds between mechanical failures. The M240 produced 2,962 mean rounds between stoppages and 6,442 mean rounds between failures. The M60 produced 846 mean rounds between stoppages and 1,669 mean rounds between failures. The weapon Australia chose over the MAG-58 in December of 1959 had less than one-third the reliability of the weapon it rejected. That data was published in the 1990s. The procurement committee met in 1959. The men who paid the difference between one-third and three-thirds of a weapon's reliability did not live to read the comparison. The M60 remained in Australian service for longer than the war that defined its reputation. The M60D flew in the twin-door mount of the RAAF's UH-1H Iroquois helicopters until the RAAF transferred the aircraft to Army Aviation in 1989. Army Aviation flew the Iroquois until its retirement in 2007. For all of that time, the men who trained on the M60 in the ground role were learning the disciplines that the Phuoc Tuy veterans had acquired the harder way. How to elevate the belt, how to change the barrel without third-degree burns, how to identify the sound the sear made when it was beginning to wear, and how to read the particular resistance of the trigger housing spring that told you the clip was close to breaking. The weapon had outlasted the war. The institutional knowledge of how to manage its failures had become part of the training. The institutional knowledge of what it had cost to acquire that understanding through combat experience rather than through adequate procurement had not become part of anything. Brian Hennessy, who served as an M60 machine gun infantryman in Vietnam, wrote about it in 1997 in a book called The Sharp End, The Trauma of a War in Vietnam. The Australian War Memorial holds the book in its collection. Its description, in Hennessy's own terms, is not heroic. "There are no heroes here," he wrote, "just ordinary men who tried to do their duty, who endured their experiences nobly, and who were changed forever as a result." The Australian War Memorial's photographic collection holds the images that sit alongside that description. Bombardier Larry Allen Davenport handling an M60 after the attacks on FSB Coral in May of 1968. Private John Iwankwu surrounded by belts at the same base after the second attack. The view across a door gunner's M60 from the Iroquois door, looking east toward Nui Dat. Men photographed with the weapon in every configuration it was designed for, and several it was not in every condition that produced it, with expressions that tell you precisely what it is like to depend on something that you cannot entirely trust and cannot put down. What those photographs do not show is the weight. They do not show the spare barrel left at the base, or the belt lying in the laterite, or the cleaning rod being rammed down the barrel in a contact. They show men with a gun. The gun looks like what it was. The cost looks like everything around it. The corporal who stepped out of ranks in front of John Gorton on or about the 8th of June, 1968, is not named in any available record. His commanding officer's account names him as a bit of a smart arse. The task force armorer found the weapon dirty and the cleaning kit elsewhere and filed his report, and the matter was closed. The Prime Minister's entourage departed Nui Dat and returned to Saigon and then to Canberra. The corporal returned to his section. The M60 went back into the jungle with him, the same weapon, with the same gas system it had always had, modified as far as the modifications had gone, carrying forward every design characteristic that the British had rejected, and the Canadians had rejected, and the Americans had documented, and the Australian Procurement Committee had noted and set aside on the 18th of December, 1959. 23 is the number, not a record to be broken, not a data point to be filed, the number a man counted in a contact, while the firing continued around him and the gun in his hands refused to do what it was supposed to do. 23 times he cleared it. 23 times he chambered around and tried again. He survived that contact. The record does not say whether every man around him did. The Procurement Committee met on the 18th of December, 1959. The men who sat in that room are in the historical record, their names attached to the decision they made. The corporal, who stood in front of the Prime Minister and spoke the truth about what they had sent him into the jungle with, is in the historical record only as a complaint. History recorded both. This account has assembled them. The question the records leave open is not what went wrong, or who knew, or what was done about it. All three of those questions have answers, and the answers are in the documents. And the documents have been there since 1959. The question is whether the country is willing to sit with what they contain, willing to read the December 1959 procurement minutes and the April 1962 reliability verdict and the June 1968 armorer's report, and understand that what connects them is not a sequence of isolated institutional failures, but the recurring shape of what happens when the men who make the decisions and the men who carry their consequences are never required to be in the same room. The corporal put them in the same room. He stepped out of ranks on a parade ground and made that room exist for 60 seconds. The Prime Minister was there. The army entered the room and found the dirt on the cleaning kit. The Procurement Committee's minutes were filed in Canberra. Now you have all of them in the same room. Now you know what the M60 actually cost. The army sent him back. The question is what you do with that.